Why is the loss of power grid the worst thing that we can face? Because it might seem to some people that there's some other things, at least to an individual, to a household, to a neighborhood, might be worse. But why would I say loss of the power grid is the worst thing? Now, identified in that class that we call, what's the worst thing that we face, that there's these 9 areas that I teach in. And when the grid is down, as in lost, what's the base cause? What's the climate, summer, winter, rural, city? That's the things you need to cover. And I'm going to break this down into these segments so we can talk about all those things so you learn about it. Now, the electrification of this country began in 1895 in Niagara Falls. Now, this is a later version of it, but the Niagara Falls plant, the first one we put in, that's when we began the large scale distribution of power. And the wonderful thing about electricity is you could take and generate at this plant right here in upstate New York, you could generate thousands of watts, megawatts of power, and you could move it hundreds of miles away. That's the magic of the power grid. And in the US, we have all these generation stations. Now, this is a map that shows the different kinds of plants and the fuels and everything, but it's scattered all over. And notice, of course, that there are places, no power is being generated right there, but it's the transmission lines that bring it to us. So it's this power grid, this magic thing that's brought about the electrification of the United States and really most of the world, the developed world. You take a look at that, the amount of power that's demonstrated down there. You see all this wonderful energy that we're able to produce and use that brings us our lifestyle, which is wonderful. I love it. I don't want it to change because it's the most comfortable, enjoyable thing. What happens if it goes away? What does that mean? So what do we mean by having a power grid? Why do we need a power grid? Most people really don't understand this. They just flip the switch, the power comes on, it's wonderful, pay your bill, and if something happens, yell at somebody to get it fixed. Well, the reason we have a power grid is because all of these individual, I'll say, cities and places where they generate the power, there's a whole bunch of places where we need to send power out there. We can just run a line out there. But one of the things that you might notice, everybody's been around one of these little gasoline generators, perhaps. You've had an emergency one or somebody's running one at a campground. And when things come on, you listen to it pick up the load, but you can hear that engine working harder. Well, that's when the load comes on. Then when the load backs off, then the generator backs off. It doesn't have to work as hard. What you're trying to do is keep it at a constant voltage so that it doesn't damage equipment. If you didn't have this generator that would fluctuate up and down in its generation, the voltage would rise and drop. That's hard in equipment. So we use it in part for the load balancing. Whatever the load is, the demand is, we want to match it with how much we generate. Well, we have load sharing that can go on. All this power that's generated in these different areas, we can send it out, and between generating plants, we can share the load, because if one of them is now at capacity, then it borrows power from another one so that it comes online enough to share the power. And this is all automatically going on with all these control stations and all the power boards and the computers that are now switching the loads and different things. It's a part of it that's so important to keep power being very reliable coming to us. You flip the switch, it's there. Another reason we have the grid is for reliability, because every now and then one of these plants goes offline. It may be shut down for maintenance and or equipment failed and something else occurred. Well, then there's excess capacity in the entire grid where it can share some of this load, send some power out to these areas. If a transformer breaks down, a big one breaks down or is damaged or is shot at, as we saw in one of the earlier classes, did damage, then they can route around the damage and keep power going there. So we have the ability to make it more reliable. There's also efficiency in this, because one of the things about power plants is they're actually most efficient when they're run at their optimum load. In other words, there's a power setting on that generator for its best gas mileage, so to speak, that you'd really like to run it at. When it's running in idle and not producing much electricity, or maybe there's nothing even connected to it and it's sitting there putting away, it's burning power, but it's not doing any work. So we have efficiency by being able to share this load and move it around so that you try to get these power plants running at their optimum load for greatest efficiency. But these big power plants don't just start up and shut down like pulling the cord on a generator. So that's where all this balancing comes in that's really, really marvelous. So this is what's going on. We have power being generated at different places around the country. We have all these big transmission lines. You've seen them. We have these power grids, and there's these interconnects. Each one of those different colors there is one of these areas where it's kind of controlled, kind of, I'll say, centrally controlled to the benefit of all the people within those geographic areas. That map with all the lines down below is all the major transmission lines that tie them all together so we can share power, try to balance things as best we can. Now, no one of those can pick up the load for the rest of the country. In other words, if the entire western grid went off the line, was damaged, went off the line, the eastern grids cannot send enough power to take care of that. So it's just to be able to share a little bit for greater reliability in times of stress. Now, we know what happened 2 years ago in February down in Texas, where their grid down there, their system down there was being overloaded because of the extreme cold, and it was trying to pick up all that load, and equipment started tripping offline to protect the equipment so they didn't burn it up. And they were unable to bring in enough power to keep things up, so they were without power for a few days. Some of those people suffered tremendously, and we had people that died. So we have reliability, we have sharing, but it's not magic, and it can't pick up the load for everything. So what does it mean about losing the power grid? Now, here's a picture. This is a satellite picture taken August 14th, 2003, where we had a loss of the power grid in an area. Now, that was just a power outage right there in a limited area. New York, Pennsylvania, and part of the eastern states there. That was a real problem for those people. We'll look at that a little bit more. But when I'm talking about loss of power grid, how about it's all dark? Now, I don't have a picture of the U.S. looking like that because that hasn't happened. However, if you take a look at North Korea versus South Korea, North Korea, an interesting controlled state up there, they don't have a lot of services and power and things like that. They don't have much of a grid. The elite people, they get some power. The rest of them, you're without. Well, think of the U.S., dark. So that's what I'm talking about, loss of power grid, when we discuss that and look at this whole thing. Now, our society, our culture, and our way of life, the things that we enjoy, is totally, absolutely dependent on this physical infrastructure that brings us the utilities and services that we have. That's what I'm talking about. And the bottom line is, it's really about our dependence. Now, there's a class that I have done. Beware of the dangers of dependence, because dependency is the problem. Now, these people in this area back on August 14, 2003, for that blackout that occurred there, they were dependent on having power on to do certain things. And when that power went off, well, it affected 508 generating units. The power plants are affected, the nuclear power reactors that were affected by it, and there were at least 11 deaths that occurred because the power went off and there wasn't backup power. Now, why those deaths, what caused them, I can't tell you right now. Just of record, there were 11 deaths that occurred. You take a look at what happened up there and that going out, and it was triggered by some tree branches that touched on some overheated voltage transmission lines near Dayton, Ohio. And then there was a cascade of events that occurred in there. It wasn't that the equipment was all damaged all of a sudden, but the equipment has some automatic systems on them, some SCADA systems and computer programs that say, okay, when this happens, I have to shut down, because if I don't, I'll overload the generating unit and burn it up, and we won't get power back. So it's circuit breakers that are in there, basically. Now, what happened in New York, this is what it looked like, and some of you may remember that. I remember seeing on the news when the power was off and the elevators didn't work and the street lights didn't work and everything is down, and the people who get home from work, they had to walk. And it was a real hassle for them. And of course, there was a lot of things that occurred that was problematic for the I'll say the few hours to a couple of days that power was off. Now, that was a short-term outage. What if it was long-term? So when we go back and think about our power grid and the fact that our power grid brings us everything, the primary interconnected controlling grids that tie it all together are, number one, the power grid, then the transportation grid that is because of the power grid, and the communications grid and the energy and fuel infrastructure that brings everything to us, and then all the other little things. So when you take a look at that and you say, golly, we got all these wonderful things that tie us together with the rail and pipeline and trucking and air traffic, ocean going, and then the communications that would be shut down. Now, does everything shut down instantly? The answer is probably not. Of course, it depends on what caused the power outage. That's one of the things we need to study at another time. Depending on the cause of the power outage, remember one of the things, those 6 things that I said you want to understand is what's the base cause of the loss of the grid? Is it truly a loss or is it just a shutdown? Or is it all lost or just a piece of it, like it was in upstate New York? Because that's going to be a totally different outcome. Now, in the US, for this power grid system that we have, there are over 25,000 power substations with voltage ratings of 34,000 volts or above. Some of them are much higher than that, into the hundreds of thousands of volts. 25,000 of them, in excess of them. Now, that's in the US. Of course, in Canada and Mexico and other places we have, but in the US, all this electrification that brings it to us, what a wonderful thing. What a wonderful genie it is. The grids, all these things that tie together. And then you see, I talked about the big ones, the communication, transportation, everything, but then all the little sub things underneath that about the water and the hospitals and the airports and air traffic and refrigeration and agriculture and food and government services and everything. And then we start looking at those. It's like, boy, this gets to be pretty serious right down to the granular level. Let's take a look at another level. This comes out of the report to assess the effects of an EMP attack on the U.S. You look at all these levels of the power, the electric power ties everything together, and you start looking through all the different layers in our society. You have the oil and gas, the communications, the water, the banking and financing, government services, emergency services, transportation. And it's like, and that's all brought to us directly or indirectly because of the electric power grid. And then look at the things that might affect you immediately right away. If the banking services are down, the banks are closed, there's no ATMs to get out cash, your card doesn't work anymore. Hospital ambulances. Now, hospitals have backup power. They have emergency diesel generators, and they will, in most cases, kick on and keep powering the emergency rooms and keep powering the operating rooms and things like that. But there are some things that could take out the emergency generators too. So that could be very serious very quickly. Fire stations, emergency call centers, and things like that. How about if the power grid is off, really off, lost? Then all of the Treasury Department checks for Social Security or VA benefits and all those things, they're not going to be going out. Now, if it comes back within a few weeks or a few months, well, they'll catch up, although it'll be chaotic. What I want you to think about is the fact that the power grid down, it really is no longer a myth. There's books written about it, and I encourage you to read some of those things. It'll get you thinking about what might happen. But there are government reports and independent reports that say this is not a myth. It can, and it likely will happen at some point. Now, that's what my class, The Worst Possible Thing That Could Happen to You, is all about. You need to go watch that. You need to look at that because that is important for you to see. Go to my website, jimsway.com, click on the YouTube, go over to that. It's the one that I put up. I think it was 3 o'clock Tuesday morning. I brought it up. Go over there and take a look at it if you haven't seen that, and then ponder that. Think about that. Does that really affect you? Do you think about it, or is it like, that's not going to happen? So go to my website, look for the YouTube link, go over, watch that class. Of course, there's other ones there too. I would encourage you to do that. And people that you know that are not getting the newsletter, the Provident Living Times, encourage them to get it because I'm going to be doing more classes. I figured out how I can do these things quickly, and I want people to at least have the idea because my intention is to get the bunkie off my back and onto yours. And if you don't want to prepare for these things, don't think about them, can't never happen, that's okay. That doesn't bother me in the least. But I do believe that we face power grid being down, not just turns off for a little while, I mean lost. So that's one of the things we're going to dig into, the base cause of loss of power grid, how serious that is, how long you might expect it to come back because of what we did earlier. Is it going to be 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years? You need to think about that and be prepared to deal with it. So that's what this whole program is about, and this series of things that I'm going to do on the risks that you face and a way of analyzing them. So we're going to pause for a moment right here, see if anybody has any questions or comments about what I just presented. I see Donna's unmuted. Do you have a comment, question?
Yeah, just this past week, I have a daughter who lives in Illinois, and they're on a farm, and she was 72 hours without power. I says, what'd you learn? And she says, well, first place, we have a well. That didn't work. We had no way to water the livestock. We had no way to keep our food refrigerated. She says it wasn't a problem because it's winter, but if it wasn't winter, it would be a huge problem. They had no way to, well, they actually had a way to heat because they do have a wood burning stove down in their basement. But otherwise, she says, we'd have been very cold. She says, nothing worked. We were, it gets dark at 6 o'clock. And she says, and then it's dark until 9 o'clock in the morning. What do you do all that time if you don't have light? I mean, I says, how would it be if you were like that every winter for the next 2 years? Every summer, every spring, every fall. In other words, long term, like you're talking about. And I think it's vital that we have these classes.
Well, I would agree. Now that was a good experience for them. There's some lessons to be learned. Of course, I tell other people, all the time, okay, you don't have to wait for the power system to break. Practice right now. Just turn it off and see what it's like. And of course, that's really inconvenient to turn it off. I mean, just shut it down and experiment with it, and that'll teach you some things you need to know. The problem with just turning off the power to your house is the water still works, the toilet still flushes, other things work, but at least that's a place to start. So good for you thinking about it and teaching them well, what would you do? You need to do some learning to be ready to deal with it. The point is, when you discover that you have something that you need to have to be well, whether it be water, warmth, food, any of those things, and if something has happened that has shut it off, then what you need to do is, how can I back that up? And if you don't know how to do that, then that's where you go study, go to some classes. But one of the things I want to caution people about is there's a lot of information. YouTube is famous for this. I love YouTube. It has lots of good things on it. That's why I'm publishing on YouTube. It has good things there. But there are also a lot of people publishing things that they're nice ideas that they think works, that they learn from somebody else, but they don't, is the bottom line. Not really, not reliably. And so you've got to be careful of your sources. That's one of the classes that I'll be talking about in the future. How do you know you're getting really good information? And EMP is one of those things that there's a lot of not so good information about EMP, and some people are going to get some real shocks. No pun intended, but they're going to get some real shocks when things don't work that they thought would work. So we'll be talking about those things. But the point that you made that's really important to your daughter in particular, she found some things that didn't work. What are we going to do if it lasts longer? Now's the time to think about it while you can be fixing those problems. And if you don't know how to fix it, well, you go learn. Talk to somebody that can help you do it, and then prove that it works. You don't know that it's really going to work until you've tested it, so you've got to do that. So anyway, Bruce, you unmuted?
I did. Now, I watched the Mountain Man stuff, 1840, 1850, and I looked particularly at those people and what they did. No electricity, no nothing. Now, the electricity in our lives has built us a lot of things, and your house will still stay built if there's no electricity. But you look at the skills that they had and what they did, and I don't think we can fathom what it would be like to be away from electricity And with all the modern conveniences that we're all sitting in right at this very moment and have to be somewhere else and provide all those things, I'm back to the mountain man and those type of things, because the grid's just supplying everything. You can, you just, it's into everything, and you'll survive for a while in your house with no electricity because you don't have to build the house. But if it's not there, you've got real trouble for shelter. You're onto a tent, you're onto a lean-to, you're onto something to try to protect yourself. It's just, I pay attention to the mountain men and the things that they do, because that's 1850 stuff, and bingo, we may be back there. And it's just hard to fathom. Tell me something that hasn't been touched by electricity. Anything in our modern society, it all has, whether it's been hauled, manufactured, finished, blah, 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 gasoline, fuels, all kinds of things. Electricity has been involved in everything.
That is so true.
It's overwhelming.
Let me tell you what the most important thing in this whole idea of power grid, loss of power grid, that I will talk about in the future. I've done other classes on it, but I'm focusing right into this idea of loss of power grid, because I'm telling you, in a general sense, this is the biggest catastrophe for this country. And one of the reasons for that is it's coast to coast, border to border. It's not just a tsunami on the coast. It's not just an earthquake that occurred in one area. It's not just a gigantic hurricane that came on shore and all this help can pour in from the outside. When the power grid goes down, it affects everybody and we're all shut down. That's why it's so catastrophic and it's a big deal. Now, for individuals, if you're in an earthquake and your house falls on you and you die, that's pretty tough on you and your family. And I'm not minimizing that. I'm just simply saying that's a very isolated compared to loss of power grid, which is coast to coast, border to border, and we're all in the same boat and there is no help coming. That's the point right there. Now, that's why it's unthinkable for some people. When I say that, there's maybe some people on this call, even though you're here wanting to learn about preparedness and emergencies and things, you're going like, that's just too much. I can't go there. Never mind. I'm not going to go back to the 1850s. So therefore it can't happen. That's why I put this idea down when we think about the worst thing, this power grid being off, that for some people, it can't happen because it's unthinkable. Well, here's the thing that I want to mention we're going to have to work on, and that is in this foundation module. That's some of my favorite classes are in there. It's going to be your attitude and your outlook, because if you can't get your head around that beforehand, because you got to think about it beforehand and think about the water and the sewer and the power and the heat and the phones and the everything and the computers, and it's all gone. And if you say, I can't live without those things, that's okay. That's a choice. But if you decide, well, I want to live, but I'm going to have to learn what to do, well, that's an attitude. And so attitude will be the single most important thing that will get you through, because the rule of freeze is this. We've heard some of these you have, but if you lose your attitude, your outlook, you lose your hope, 3 seconds and it's over. Now you may still be alive, but if you shut down, said, ain't worth living, I'm not going to keep going, you curl up in a ball, go into fetal position, it's over. Took you 3 seconds to make that decision. Now, if you got through that, and this is also why these are in the order when you look at this box up here, in the foundation, that's about your attitude, your outlook, and a bunch of other things in there too, but it's mostly about your attitude and outlook. Number 2 on that list is clothing. Why clothing? Well, in the weather that we've been having recently in my area here, where it's been down around 0, below 0, we've had snow and wind and those kinds of things. If you were outside dressed in regular street clothing, your shirt sleeve clothing inside your house that's warm, and you were outside all of a sudden, you're going to live maybe 3 minutes. You could die in quickly, probably 3 hours. So the one that'll get you in 3 minutes is lack of oxygen. So if you're in a situation where you're suffocated, 3 minutes, you're going to die. Then 3 hours with the loss of the heat that you have around you, your building and everything, that can damage you to the point where you're going to die or die soon. Then 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, 3 months in isolation without communication. Now, those are just kind of general numbers, but to give you the idea, within seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, you can expire. You've got to take care of those things. So that's part of what I'm going to be talking about, because if the grid goes down, no, I make the point, watch that class VM, I'm telling you, it will go away. I'm not a gloom and doom guy. Go watch that if you haven't seen that. The worst thing that we face, and you can agree with me or you can disagree with me, but I'm simply going to say the chances are 100% that sometime in the next 2 weeks to 50 years, the power grid is going to go away. And that class will teach you why, just in a very quick overview. We'll dig into it a little deeper in the future, because I want to do short classes that I can publish. People will come watch them and keep digging in a little deeper, a little deeper, a little deeper. So that's what I'm doing here. Any other quick comments on this? And I'm going to move on to the third class tonight if nobody else wants to wade in on this loss of power grid thing. Donna.
Well, I don't mean to belabor this, but if we were to lose through an EMP our electricity, we lose more than that. Yeah, you can say, oh, well, I've got a horse to ride, but you won't have a horse to ride for long if you can't feed it in the winter. And if the farmers cannot get into the fields because their equipment is no longer functions, they can't cut the hay, they can't cut the grain. You lose it all. You lose it all. I mean, we are literally at that point going back to the 1800s.
That's right. We have a total dependence on our lifestyle, the way we live it, which is a wonderful lifestyle, on the electric power grid, that it will be there. That's why to some people that can't happen because it's too much, it's too big. Therefore, I don't need to worry about it. And I tell those people that's okay. If that's where you are, that's just fine. But my intention is to get you to at least plant the seed to think about, could it really go away? Could that really happen? Because I just want the monkey off my back onto your back, so to speak, and then you can choose what to do about it. And I've done my part. That's what I'm trying to do, is do my part to help you in these areas. That's why we're going to talk about the power grid as a way of focusing. And if you can take care of loss of power grid, you can take care of anything. Now, there's some very specialized things. What do you do in an earthquake? What do you do about evacuating a fire? All those kinds of things. But those are very specialized and very localized for you. And some of those things, you can learn those emergency responses there. But the big one is when we lose the power grid in this country. That's the one that gets us all into very serious trouble. I'm going to turn off my recording for a second. We'll go to our next one.